All right, hello and welcome to lesson 6.3. We will be talking about in here the amendment process as well as the actual structure of the Constitution. You are still in module 6 on the Constitution. Lesson objective for today: student will be able to explain how the Constitution is structured and the process by which it is changed. So soon after the Constitution was written, and in fact even as it was being written, there was concern over whether the government it was creating would even succeed. If it did last, how long, and what if future generations discovered flaws in the document? What would they do? How would they respond? What if the national government it created was too weak or too strong? And what if state governments wanted even more power? Thomas Jefferson, our third president, said that the issues with the document were bound to arise. And so he argued that there would need to be a method by which the Constitution could be amended or changed. So whenever I say amend in this video, know that that means change. It's just a formal way of saying that. And in fact, Jefferson saw a change to the document not only as inevitable, but also a good thing. He argued that future generations would need to be viewed as a distinct nation, meaning they had the right to popular sovereignty just as much as past generations. He's quoted as saying famously that the earth belongs to the living, not to the dead. In other words, the desires of dead people could not dictate the desires of future people, especially if they are all part of the same nation. Now, the fact that our Constitution has endured for well over 200 years says a lot about the wisdom of our framers, as well as their biases. Okay? Indeed, the fact that it has undergone so few changes over 2 centuries is, on its face, pretty astonishing. Our Constitution has endured a civil war, presidential assassinations, and even economic crises, thus becoming the world's oldest written Constitution. And since 1789, Jefferson's instinct has been verified time and time again, because there have only been 27 formal changes to the document. Okay, he was right. Changes would need to be made. So before we dig into the amendment process, let's take a peek at the actual structure of the Constitution. You've already been introduced to the preamble, okay, which was lesson 5.1. There are 7 articles of the Constitution. This is like the real meat of the document. And then there are, of course, 27 amendments. The 7 articles are as follows, all right? In Article 1, we get the functions of the legislative branch. In Article 2, we get the functions of the executive branch. In Article 3, we get the functions of the judicial branch. All right, so those are usually the most referenced articles of the Constitution. That's where we get the actual separation of powers and the checks and balances. Okay, so those key features of limited government. In Article 4, we get the relationship between the states and the federal government. This is federalism. Okay, you might recall that as one of the features of limited government. In Article 5, we get the process by which the Constitution will be changed. In Article 6, the Constitution is declared as the highest law of the land. And then in Article 7, it describes how the Constitution is going to be ratified, in other words, approved by all the states. Now, the 27 amendments are as follows. I want you to only really focus on the ones that are highlighted, obviously, but fill in the chart as you go. All right, so number 1 through 10, these are the Bill of Rights, and we will learn more about those in Module 7. But just understand that they lay out the basic liberties being given to American citizens. Okay, Amendment 13 abolished slavery, of course, the infamous 13th Amendment. That was 1865, shortly after the Civil War. The 14th Amendment defined citizenship. It also expanded due process, and it established equal protection. This is where we get the infamous Equal Protection Clause. Or, excuse me, the famous, not the infamous, the famous Equal Protection Clause. And then the 15th Amendment prohibited denying the right to vote on the basis of race or color or previously being a slave. So the 15th Amendment protected voting, the 14th Amendment gave equal protection, and the 13th gave essentially, well, it abolished slavery. These are all three considered the Reconstruction Amendments. In other words, they came about in the Reconstruction era of our country's history. Okay. Number 18, again, I'm only hitting on the key ones, the important amendments, the ones to know. The 18th Amendment prohibited the production, transportation, and sale of alcohol. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. This was incredibly important, right? But look at that year, 1920. Only 100 years ago, nearly, right? Women were given the right to vote. Incredible. 21 repealed the 18th Amendment, so alcohol was no longer an illegal substance. 22 created presidential term limits. Okay, so before this point, there was nobody was saying, okay, you can only run for president this many times. You can only be president this many times. Presidents had just been going by the example set by Washington, which was, I will serve 2 terms, 4 years each, so a total of 8 years, and that's that. But in 1951, Congress saw fit to actually set a limit. And then finally, number 26, this was a super important one because it actually affects all of us. It lowered the voting age to 18, and that was 1971, around the era of the Vietnam War. The rationale sort of being that if a young man can be drafted to go fight in Vietnam at the age of 18, but he can't vote for the people that are actually sending him there, right, there's clearly an issue with the system. So the actual amendment process, remember this is from Article 5 of the Constitution. Well, so there are 2 ways that an amendment can be proposed. The first is that Congress, with the approval of at least 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate, can propose an amendment, meaning they would draft what this amendment would look like. Okay, 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate. The second way, the second method, would be that delegates at a national convention called by Congress, and at the request of at least 2/3 of the state legislatures, could also decide that an amendment should be proposed. Please note, though, that method 2 has never actually been used, and that the 27 amendments we actually have all been proposed through the first method. Okay. Now, once proposed, it's not actually an amendment yet. That will require a ratification process, an approval process. And there are 2 ways that can happen. So essentially, once the amendment has actually been formally proposed, Congress must send the proposed amendment to the 50 states for ratification. Okay, and that's done again through these 2 ways. The first is the proposed amendment is voted on by the state legislatures. And if 3/4 of the states approve of the proposal, then it is added to the Constitution. Okay, so a quick note, a quick reminder, every single state in our country has a legislature. And these are essentially a miniature Congress for that particular state. It consists of a House and it consists of a Senate. Okay, again, at the state level. So this is where state-specific laws will be passed. So this is where the proposed amendment, right, that comes down from Congress would be voted on. Okay, that's the first method. The second method would be this. The citizens of a certain state elect delegates to a convention that would be called in that particular state, specifically to consider, to debate that amendment, again, that came from Congress. Passage by this method, though, requires that 3/4 of the state conventions approve of the proposed amendment. Okay, now if you're a little confused, that's perfectly all right. This visual should help you. Okay, notice on the left you have the different proposal methods, and on the right you have the different ratification methods. So the first proposal method, The amendment is proposed by a 2/3 vote in each House of Congress, House of Reps, and the Senate. 2/3 vote. Or the amendment is proposed by a national convention, called by Congress at the request of 2/3 of the state legislatures. But keep in mind, this method has never actually been used. Now, over to ratification. The first method, the amendment is ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. Okay, so 3/4 of the country would approve it. Or the amendment is ratified by 3/4 of the state conventions, which have to be called by each state, where the citizens would vote on delegates who would attend the convention to debate the amendment and eventually vote on whether they approve as a convention of the amendment. Okay, so in your notes you have this diagram, so please don't be intimidated by the details here. Okay, we'll definitely talk about it a lot more, but this is an important understanding, okay, because we learned about the Constitution, we learned about the amendments, right, the critical ones, but you need to understand, right, that it took its own process to allow these amendments to actually even come into existence. So in conclusion, please understand that the amendment process is yet another example of how the Constitution was designed to put limits on the power of government. The fact that it can be changed only reinforces popular sovereignty. The fact that it is such a difficult and time-consuming process, however, also reinforces the separation of powers, given that it is fundamentally Congress who has historically kicked off the amendment process. Recall that the 27 amendments have all been proposed in Congress, which is the first proposal method outlined in Article 5. Know also that there have been over 10,000 proposed changes to the Constitution since 1789, and the fact that only 27 have actually been executed is proof that the system was intended to be challenging, thus ensuring that only major important changes took place. After all, imagine how long and confusing the Constitution would be in 2019 if 10,000 amendments had actually been added. Okay, it would be impossible to comprehend. This was a purposefully difficult process. The framers had a certain degree of wisdom with this. Okay, it limits the power of the citizens, but it also reinforces the power of the citizens. Okay. And that concludes this lesson.